What happens when an entire nation's belief in its own invincibility is vaporized in a single blinding flash? It's August 1945, and deep beneath Tokyo, inside a bunker more storm shelter than command center, Japan's leaders go through the motions. Maps, briefings, the tired choreography of war. The room smells of pipe smoke and paper. Men in uniform steady themselves on routine. Then reality arrives, not as a report, but as a rumor at first, an impossible message that will explode into proof. In a few hours, the world those men trusted will be overturned, and everything they thought knits their courage together will begin to unravel. It's the morning of August 6, 1945. In the Imperial General Headquarters, the day begins with practiced motions. Officers in dark uniforms, maps spread like weathered skin across lacquered tables, telephones humming with routine reports. War has become a grim, predictable comfort. Briefings, coffee, clipped orders, the quiet circulation of fatalistic consensus. They trust the ritual. It steadies them. It hides the cracks. Outside, Tokyo moves on. But here, time is measured in dispatches and the slow, confident cadence of men convinced they know the rules of the game. Nobody expects an exception. Not yet. 8:15 a.m. That comfort shatters like glass. A communications officer bursts into the war room, breathless, mud-streaked, eyes wild, clutching a cable stamped Hiroshima. He throws the paper onto the table. Fragments spill out, broken place names, numbers, a word repeated like a bad coin. The room goes instantly still. Generals lean in. Nobody speaks. The message is frantic, half-formed, and it names the city everyone has always assumed was safe: Hiroshima. The message that lands on the table is unlike anything the generals have seen. Short, broken lines at first, then a sentence that freezes every breath in the room. A single, catastrophic explosion of unimaginable power. They read it twice because the words refuse to be true. Houses gone, streets gone, entire neighborhoods erased. Then the line that makes the room go hollow. The city has simply ceased to exist. No qualifier, no comforting detail, just emptiness. For a moment, there's only the hiss of the fluorescent lights and the sound of men trying to pretend they understand what erased actually means. Field Marshal Hada's morning briefing stalls mid-sentence. Men who live by timetables suddenly forget their lines. A map lies open. Pens hover. Radios hum. The bunker inhales one long, awful pause. Faces harden. Eyes flick to the door. The routine has broken. Something urgent and impossible has slammed into their day, and for the first time, the generals are plainly unsettled. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto burst into the war room, the fully decoded message folded tight in his hand like a charge. He didn't hesitate. He thrust the paper across the table to the generals. His face was ashen. His voice broke when he said nothing. For a moment, everyone stared at the black ink, the silence heavier than any shelling. A single page that felt like an indictment. The words on the page make no sense. Unprecedented destruction. A single blast. Short, clinical fragments that shouldn't belong to a war report, but that land like thunder. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto's hand is still outstretched. The paper looks like evidence in a trial the room wasn't ready to hold. For a long, charged beat, no one speaks. Faces go slack. Minds race for explanations. Conventional raid, sabotage, anything but this. Then the room itself seems to inhale and hold. What has happened to Hiroshima? The question hangs, not a line on a page, but an accusation, and it refuses to be answered. For a long, stunned beat, the bunker simply could not make the pages add up, because their brains were still wired for a different kind of war. Years of island fighting and firebomb raids had taught these men to measure destruction in tonnage and sorties, in waves of aircraft and crews. Anything that didn't fit that ledger was easier to reject than to rethink. So when the words on the decoded sheet suggested a single apocalyptic blast, the room's first reflex was disbelief. General Umezu, the Army Chief of Staff, didn't hide it. He looked at the report with cold dismissiveness, as if the very idea were a bad rumor unworthy of officers' time. Field Marshal Umezu snaps the room back into a story they understand. He won't hear of miracles or new weapons. It has to be familiar. Hundreds of B-29s, he says, short and sharp. Nothing less could inflict such damage. His voice is more than argument. It's a lifeline to the doctrine that has kept them going. Mass raids, attrition, predictable physics. To admit otherwise would be to admit they've been wrong about everything. Around the table, faces tighten. For a moment, the bunker breathes easier, anchored by a conventional explanation, until someone quietly orders the radar and observer logs to be checked. But the facts refuse to fit the story they'd been telling themselves. Orders were barked, sharp, clipped, maps shoved aside, radios keyed, teletypes fed paper like a wound. Men in uniform hunched over oscilloscope screens and logbooks, eyes hunting for a mistake they could blame on equipment or human error. Clerks double-checked timestamps. Pilots were radioed. Radar tapes were pulled and replayed. Everything was combed for a conventional explanation, anything that would keep the world they knew intact. They wanted to be wrong. They needed to be wrong. So they checked, and checked again, bracing for whatever truth the reports would finally hand them. The air defense reports come back, and the room holds its breath. Because the impossible is no longer a rumor on paper, it's a hard fact. Every radar log, every observer note, every frantic transmission lines up. 3 B-29s crossed Hiroshima that morning. 3, not dozens, not a carpet of bombers. 3 planes. The word crashes into the bunker like a physical blow. Pens stop, voices die. Men stare at columns of numbers that refuse to explain a city erased. They had ordered checks and rechecks. Now the checks answer with a single, terrifying number, and nothing in their doctrine can make it make sense. For 3 years, their whole playbook had been numbers. Sorties, tonnage, radar tracks, the steady arithmetic of attrition that underwrote every plan. So when the reports returned, and the line item read, in plain, brutal font, 3 B-29s, it didn't register as a small discrepancy. The math was wrong. The equation didn't balance. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a fissure in the logic they'd used to justify sacrifice and strategy. Suddenly, every estimate, every confident briefing looked fragile. Officers who'd never been wrong fumbled maps and radios because now they had to make sense of an outcome their calculations couldn't possibly produce, and the pilots at the edge of the blast zone were already calling in. 10 a.m. Pilots on reconnaissance hover at the fringe of the blast zone and radio in. Their voices are thin, clipped, trembling, half terror, half awe. They fumble for words and fail. No pilot trained in conventional war can describe what they're seeing. A monstrous column of smoke and light blazing into the sky. A silent, obscene geometry that makes maps and experience feel useless. The room goes very, very quiet. They fumble for words and fail. Over the radio, voices crack as they try to explain something beyond any book or battle plan. A colossal mushroom cloud, not gray, but a sick, boiling palette, blinding white at its core, edged with copper and purple, a grotesque, roiling flower, stacked 40,000 feet into the sky. It rises like a second sun, a column of smoke and light with a cap that churns and glows, throwing an awful new kind of shadow across the landscape. For those listening, for those watching, it isn't just an explosion, it's an answer, and it leaves no room for comfortable doubt. It was a monstrous spectacle, a new sun blooming where no sun belonged, a towering column of fire and vapor that punched 40,000 feet into the sky and painted the horizon in impossible colors. Pilots and lookouts who'd seen every kind of fire now fell silent. That glow could be seen for more than 150 miles, turning noon into an alien midday, erasing familiar landmarks and making the air itself seem smaller. Nobody could file this under ordinary. The sight fixed itself in their minds like a verdict. This was a different kind of weapon, and there was no going back. At 11 a.m., witnesses begin to arrive at Foreign Minister Togo's office. Shabby, filthy, eyes wide and empty, their clothes half burned, and their voices barely more than breath. They don't have time for formalities. They spill out fragments. A light so intense it felt like the sky had been struck. Streets that simply stopped existing. People gone where people once stood. They try to find words and fail. Their hands mime an impossible instant. Togo listens, face unreadable, as these living pieces of the city paint a picture no map could show, a human report that turns rumor into reality and forces the room to lean in. They filed into Togo's office like ghosts, faces gray with dust, eyes raw, and their voices came out in ragged fragments, but the picture they painted was immediate and terrible. A silent, white flash that burned brighter than the sun, so pure it erased shadows, as if light itself had been scooped away. A heat that didn't roar so much as sear, flattening paper and flesh into the same charred film. Streets turned into glass, and roofs gone, as if a giant hand had wiped a map clean. They kept repeating the same helpless line. It was light, then nothing. The room fell quiet, waiting for what came next. Then came the second act, a shockwave that hit like a physical command, instantaneous, brutal, flattening the city center in a single, deafening pulse. Streets became level ground. Buildings that had stood for decades were pulverized into dust. Survivors talk of being thrown clear, of hearing the earth itself crack. And behind that blast rose a firestorm so vast it behaved like a living thing, drawing air in with hurricane force, spitting embers into a sky turned dark by its own smoke, spawning winds and clouds born of flame. In the span of minutes, the city's weather changed. The city itself, it seemed, simply vanished. The consensus is horrifying. It wasn't merely another raid, another ruined skyline. Hiroshima had been liquefied into absence in a single, terrible instant. Witnesses speak of a light like a second sun, then silence, then a shock that folded buildings into themselves. The streets became ash, the river a mirror of nothing. There were no piled corpses, no smoldering skeletons of buildings, only an expanse where a city had been, as if someone had taken an eraser to history. That realization lands like a new kind of weapon, not just destruction, but erasure. By 2 p.m., Japan's leaders would be forced to face what this meant. 2 p.m. The Supreme War Council assembles in the Emperor's bunker beneath the palace, a room built to survive bombs, but not the news that sits heavy in the air. The usual clatter of protocol has gone. In its place is a pressure so tangible it feels like someone pressing on everyone's chest. Officers gather around a scarred table, maps and fragmented reports fanned out like evidence. Faces are drained, hands clenched. Outside, the capital goes about its day. Inside, silence waits, brittle and expectant. This meeting isn't for strategy. It's for a truth they've been trying not to name. Prime Minister Suzuki stares from face to face, looking for something he no longer expects to find. Certainty, bravado, any hint that this room still believes in the rules that once governed victory and defeat. The fragmented reports fanned across the table feel like a confession. Creased paper that speaks of a violence their maps and manuals never imagined. Men in starched uniforms sit unusually small, fingers tapping dossiers, eyes drifting to the bunker ceiling as if answers might fall from above. The air is tight with a stunned private dread. He lets the silence hang, measuring each breath, knowing he has to turn this shock into words. "Gentlemen," Suzuki says, voice thin and suddenly small in the bunker's heavy air, "we must understand what has happened." For a beat, there is only the sound of papers being straightened, the rustle of maps, the slow, stunned breathing of men who thought they already knew the rules. Those 5 words do something worse than shock. They force attention inward, toward mistakes, illusions, the hated arithmetic no one wanted to do. The reports on the table stop being remote facts and become accusations. Faces harden, old certainties tremble. This is the moment the war stops being about the enemy and starts being about what they refuse to see. Anami slams his hand on the table, the crack of wood louder than any report. "This is American propaganda," he snaps, voice ringing with defiance, a raw physical refusal to let reality in. Papers flutter around him like thin shields against a truth he cannot bear. The Prime Minister's calm plea for understanding is swallowed by muscle and myth. He frames Hiroshima as a lie, an enemy trick meant to break the nation's spirit, because to admit otherwise would undo the story that justified every sacrifice. In that slammed palm and shouted accusation, you don't just see obstinacy. You see a command culture bargaining with denial. Anami slams his hand again, eyes blazing, and the denial pours out like a challenge. "They are trying to break our spirit with lies," he snaps. "Hiroshima was hit by a massive conventional attack, nothing more. Short, simple, full of purpose." To him, accepting anything else would be surrender before the emperor spoke it. Better a lie that keeps men fighting than a truth that melts an army. Around the table the air stiffens. Some nod, some gape, but Anami's words hang there like a shield, bought at the cost of seeing what might actually be true. Admiral Toyota, the quiet man who trusted only numbers and radar blips, leans forward and lays it out without flourish. "Our observers and our radar confirm it, General. 3 aircraft. Only 3. The words slap the room into a stunned silence, not the noisy denial of propaganda, but the colder, harder kind of disbelief that comes when data refuses to bend to hope. Faces that had traded on courage and ritual pale as the math settles in. 3 planes cannot make that kind of ruin. Toyota's line becomes an accusation. It isn't just Hiroshima they must now explain. It's every comforting story they told themselves about the war. That tiny, brutal fact, 3 planes and a city gone, slams into everything they'd built their war on. For years, their doctrine wasn't factories or logistics. It was spirit. Yamato Damashi, the conviction that courage and sacrifice could cancel out material weakness. That belief let them explain away defeats, recast setbacks as tests of will. Now the numbers refuse to be massaged into myth. If one small raid can erase an entire city, spirit doesn't win battles, production does. Suddenly the rituals and brave speeches sound like superstition. In that bunker, the leaders see the truth at last. They've been fighting on the wrong battlefield. For 3 years, their strategy rested on one sacred idea. The pure, unyielding spirit of the Japanese warrior, the Yamato Damashi, was their greatest weapon. It wasn't just morale, it was doctrine. Officers spoke of honor and sacrifice as if those virtues could tip the balance of iron and fuel. Kamikaze, bonsai charges, holding ground to the last man, each act was animated by a belief that willpower could substitute for factories and steel. That faith allowed defeats to be reframed as tests of character rather than failures of logistics. But now, with reconnaissance and reports piling up on the table, that belief is about to meet numbers it cannot argue with. They knew they were outproduced. They knew America could build 10 planes for their one, 10 ships for their one. That fact sat like a quiet, ugly ledger at the back of every strategy room, glanced at, then set aside. Doctrine would not yield to arithmetic. The Yamato Damashi, honor, resolve, the unbreakable will, had to mean something, so they built plans around spirit instead of supply lines, valor instead of production. It was a conscious gamble. To face the numbers was to admit the war was lost. To ignore them was to keep fighting for an idea, even as reality stacked the odds against them. They knew they were outgunned. 10 American planes for every Japanese one, 10 ships for every ship they could field. So their answer wasn't to match factories, it was to make victory so unbearably costly that the Americans would simply refuse to pay the price. Fortify the beaches, train civilians to fight, turn every town into a killing ground. Inflict such staggering, unsustainable casualties that the headlines, the grieving mothers, the mounting body counts would break the will of a democracy. It was raw, brutal logic, not to win in the conventional sense, but to make winning unbearable. They genuinely believed a supposedly soft, materialistic America could not stomach that kind of bloodletting. They were certain, convinced by propaganda and wishful thinking, that America's supposedly weak, materialistic society would crumble under true bloodshed. In staff rooms and pamphlets, they pictured war-weary mothers, shopkeepers shuttering their windows, politicians buckling to public outrage. Their whole strategy rested on a fragile assumption that industrial might could be outlasted if you made the price of victory unbearably high. So they prepared to bleed the invader until his will snapped. It felt elegant, even righteous, because it reassured them. And because it reassured them, no one asked the brutal question, what if they were wrong? That possibility would arrive, uninvited, and change everything. Now that entire philosophy teeters on the edge. For years they'd cloaked their strategy in myth, Yamato Damashi, unbreakable resolve, honor as armor, a moral dividend that made up for every missing plane and ship. Hiroshima rips that dividend away. A single flash from a single aircraft vaporizes the moral logic they'd relied on. If one bomb can erase an entire city in an instant, what practical force does spirit really hold? Courage becomes an abstraction. Sacrifice becomes a cruel irony. The rules have been rewritten overnight, and everything built on belief looks dangerously, suddenly, irrelevant. Tactics are useless. Bayonet charges are meaningless. Their sacrifices are rendered almost pointless. For decades, the command had sold itself a sacred math, spirit over steel, honor over numbers. Now that math collapses in a single flash. What once cost lives and land can be erased from the sky without a landing party, without a siege, without glory. The battlefield they trained for no longer exists. What matters is factories, engineers, patents, and supply yards, things you cannot counter with courage alone. The room goes quiet because a new, uglier truth settles in. If they can make one of these, what else are they hiding? It becomes clear in that moment. America isn't merely outproducing Japan. It's operating on a different axis of power. Not just factories and ships and planes, but laboratories, engineers, equations, an industrial scientific machine that turns knowledge into weapons faster than armies can adapt. For decades, Japan measured strength in courage and sacrifice. Now they face a force that converts steel and research into instant apocalypse. Their old metrics mean nothing. Technology rewrites the rules of warfare, and Japan has no answer in its arsenal. The question, suddenly urgent and personal, is simple and terrible. If they can do this, what else are they hiding? For a beat, the bunker holds its breath. A single, terrible question now lodged behind every throat. If they have this, what else are they hiding? It's not just another weapon they fear. It's an entire hidden economy of machines and minds, factories humming in secret, labs where physics became a weapon, fleets and bomber forces produced by an industry Japan never truly measured. Faces that had argued away defeats realized they were arguing with ghost numbers. The dread is precise and logical now. One bomb implies many. One program implies a system. And as that thought lands, the room knows someone must answer it with facts. At 4 p.m., Colonel Sato is summoned to the bunker. A thin, methodical man, he doesn't traffic in honor or slogans, only numbers. The room leans in. For the first time, data will speak louder than doctrine. Colonel Sato unrolls maps and stacks of figures, and the war room falls quiet. Numbers spill across the table, production schedules, shipping manifests, payroll ledgers, simple, unforgiving arithmetic. He speaks calmly, but the charts are merciless. Output curves that climb like cliffs, factory footprints the size of cities, delivery timetables that make hope seem quaint. He doesn't linger on the flash over Hiroshima. He traces the line backward to its source. The laboratories, the steel mills, the assembly lines, the budgets that feed them. What he lays out is not a single miracle weapon, but the whole industrial machine that made miracles routine. Sato pulls the curtain back and the room goes quiet. Then he starts to speak in numbers. The United States, he shows them, wasn't producing a few more planes or a handful of extra ships. It was running at a scale that made their estimates look like child's counting. Aircraft carriers stacked in dry docks, tanks rolling out of factories like clockwork, bombers poured from assembly lines by the dozens, no, by the hundreds, until the figures themselves swallowed the map. This was industrial power turned into relentless arithmetic, orders of magnitude greater than anything Japan had imagined, and the implications sank like a stone. Their picture of the enemy had been small, comfortable, and disastrously wrong. Sato doesn't simply correct their numbers. He exposes the mirror they've been staring into. Intelligence twisted into comfort, maps and reports massaged until reality fit the story they wanted to tell. What they called estimates were excuses. What they called warnings were filed away. He lays out the pattern. Every inconvenient fact ignored. Every defeat reframed as proof of spirit, not failure of capacity. The room realizes this wasn't just bad intel. It was institutional self-deception, a bureaucracy dedicated to preserving hope at the cost of truth. The air goes cold. Then Sato leans forward and delivers the brutal, unavoidable conclusion. Sato lays the paper down and speaks like a man reading a death notice. If the Americans can build a weapon like this, he states, his voice flat, then their scientific and industrial base is beyond any numerical comparison. The room goes quiet. Too quiet. Faces that had scrolled through denial freeze. Numbers and charts that once comforted them now feel obscene. Factories, labs, research budgets that dwarf whole ministries. It isn't just one brilliant weapon. It's proof of a system, an economy and a science machine operating on a different scale. He doesn't need to spell it out. The only answer hangs there, ugly and unavoidable. Sato's words hang in the bunker like a verdict. We must assume they don't have one of these bombs. We must assume they have many. It's not theory anymore. It's arithmetic with lives attached. Many means factories, trained technicians, fuel, logistics, and a whole national effort turning a deadly concept into repeatable, reliable destruction. The generals trade looks and feel their strategy unspool. Honor and sacrifice suddenly seem brittle against cold industrial scale. This is not a miracle or a fluke. This is a system. If the Americans can make many, then the war they imagined is over, and a new, terrifying reality begins. How do you keep fighting when the story you've told yourself for years, that spirit can beat steel, that honor can outmatch industry, is suddenly exposed as a comforting lie? In that bunker, the theory of war collides with a cold, new fact. One bomb, dropped from one plane, erased a city. Short prayers and long speeches don't change arithmetic. Faces that once radiated defiance now flicker with something sharper: doubt, fear, the slow collapse of meaning. If victory depended on making the enemy pay a price, what price can possibly match wholesale annihilation? Colonel Sato, the man with the data, is about to remind them of a warning they chose to ignore. Sato doesn't glare or plead. He methodically rewinds the tape, back to 1941, and a single, inconvenient voice. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, who had cautioned them that America was a sleeping giant and that a prolonged war would be unwinnable. He reminds them how that warning was filed away, dismissed as defeatism or worse, because admitting it would have meant changing everything they believed about honor, spirit, and sacrifice. The room shifts as the memory lands. This was not a new mistake, but an old one repeated. They had been warned, Sato says quietly, and they chose not to listen. Back in 1941, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the strike on Pearl Harbor, had tried to puncture the myth of invincibility. He told them bluntly, America's factories were a sleeping giant. Let them wake, and a prolonged war would be unwinnable. They nodded, but treated his warning like background noise, filtered away by pride, doctrine, and hope. Years of defeats should have been proof. Instead, they doubled down on denial. So when Sato raised Yamamoto's warning now, it wasn't fresh intelligence. It was the truth they'd refused to act on. And that refusal would cost them everything. Sato leans forward and, with the calm of a man who has always trusted numbers more than myths, begins to list the assumptions that guided Japan to this moment. That sweeping early conquests would stretch American supply lines thin. That, across the ocean, soldiers would lack the will to die for a cause they supposedly didn't share. That industrial muscle could be outmaneuvered by spirit alone. He speaks slowly, each point peeling back a layer of self-deception. These weren't strategies, he says, but wishful thinking dressed up as doctrine. The room grows colder as he lays the logic bare, priming them for the proof those assumptions will soon meet. Sato lays it out plain. Every grand assumption they'd clung to had been falsified in blood. From the grinding, unglamorous slog at Guadalcanal to the bitter, island-by-island fights that culminated at Okinawa. Yet each catastrophe was massaged into a story of temporary misfortune, a hiccup on the road to victory. Losses were blamed on bad weather, bad luck, or cowardly subordinates. Inconvenient facts were rewritten or ignored. That habit of spin did more than soothe pride. It calcified into a refusal to see reality. Instead of learning, they doubled down, and speaking the truth became dangerous. He lays it out bluntly. Denial wasn't an ad hoc choice, it was doctrine. In their closed command culture, inconvenient facts were erased and inconvenient officers sidelined. To question the narrative was not debate, it was betrayal. Careers ended, promotions vanished, whistleblowers were branded traitors. So every report that hinted at American advantage was massaged, every setback recast as proof of eventual victory. Nobody wanted to be the man who said, "We can't win," because those words meant exile or worse. That institutional silence helps explain how a nation could march toward catastrophe with its eyes deliberately shut. To understand Anami's fury, you have to see it as policy, not pathology. In a system where doubt equals treason and bad news is punished, stubbornness becomes survival. Clinging to the story that keeps the machine intact is the sensible move. He isn't flinging himself against evidence out of madness. He's defending a worldview hammered into the command structure for years, one that turned inconvenient facts into heresy. So his denial is predictable, almost inevitable. And that's why, when August 6th forces the truth into the room for the first time, it lands like an intruder, unwelcome but wholly unsurprising. On August 6th, the bunker changed. For years, the room had been insulated by ritual, by proud phrases and comforting myths. Now something nobody wanted had walked in and refused to leave. Silence fell like a weight. Faces that had learned to smile through defeat went slack. Anami's stubborn rationales, the fierce, defensive logic that had kept denial alive, suddenly looked less like conviction and more like armor against a harsh light. Papers on the table stopped being props and became evidence. The conversation narrowed. Reality, blunt and implacable, had arrived, and the next voice in the room would have to name it. Sato's briefing feels less like a report and more like a post-mortem, a brutal autopsy laid out in spreadsheets and satellite photos that leave no room for comfort. He peels back the myth, line by line. America didn't build lone wonders. It built systems. Factories that never stopped, research labs fed by billions, supply chains that could turn raw steel into whole air forces. The numbers are cruelly simple and indisputable. This is not about courage or honor anymore. It's about machines, infrastructure, and scale. The enemy they'd imagined as decadent and fragile is revealed as a production engine. Their old excuses dissolve. It wasn't a case of America choosing between butter or bullets. The U.S. was cranking out both, full tilt. Cars rolling off assembly lines by the thousands, tanks welded and shipped, refrigerators and radios filling homes, even as B-29s filled the skies. Production wasn't incremental. It was industrial mass making on a scale that made Japan's best estimates look quaint. That sheer abundance erased the logic of Japan's war plan. You couldn't bleed an enemy who could replace losses overnight. And worse, those same factories and universities weren't just churning out metal. They were feeding a secret, scientific engine that could produce weapons no one in Tokyo had ever imagined. Then Sato pivots to the Manhattan Project, and the room goes quiet. He walks them through it not like a headline, but like an industrial ledger. Tens of thousands of scientists, secret plants scattered across the continent, whole universities and factories reorganized into a single purpose. He names costs that feel unreal, sums greater than Japan's entire wartime budget, spent in secret, mobilized with the speed and coordination of a national economy. It wasn't a single weapon built in a shed. It was a nationwide scientific enterprise. When he finishes, the generals can no longer treat the bomb as an anomaly. The bomb is proof that they are fighting the work of a civilization operating on a different plane of existence. It is not a clever tactic or a one-off miracle. It is the visible product of an industrial scientific ecosystem vast beyond imagination. Labs and factories, engineers and technicians, budgets and bureaucracy, all geared toward producing destruction with brutal efficiency. For the men in the bunker, this is a conceptual earthquake. Every myth about courage and sacrifice suddenly reads like a storybook beside a machine that can erase a city in an instant. This is no longer about honor. It's about survivability against an enemy that makes weapons the way others make bread. Foreign Minister Togo leans forward, eyes on the smeared intelligence sheets, and asks the question that will haunt the room. We had intelligence pointing to this, to their industrial power. Why did we choose to ignore it? It lands like a thrown stone. For a moment, there is only the rustle of paper and the ticking of a clock. He isn't hunting for scapegoats. He's naming a collective failure. Pride, propaganda, the comforting lie that courage could substitute for factories. Admitting the truth would mean admitting defeat. The silence after his question is heavy, because everyone in that bunker already knows the cost of answering. He answers his own question with a quiet, devastating honesty that still feels like a verdict in the room, a voice that strips away every comforting fiction they'd been living in. The words are short, almost casual, but they carry the weight of an entire failed strategy, because to acknowledge it was to admit we could not win. For a moment, the bunker is a cathedral of silence. No one knows how to proceed, because admission means surrendering not just land, but pride, doctrine, and the stories they told themselves to keep going. Those 3 words change everything. The meeting, suddenly, has nowhere left to go. Admiral Toyota leans forward, voice low and bitter. We were fighting with bamboo spears against a machine gun. The line lands like a verdict. Short, brutal, impossible to argue with. In that single image, the whole fantasy collapses. The sacred valor, the honor-bound resolve, the idea that spirit alone could blunt industrial fury. Faces around the table go still. Numbers and charts suddenly mean more than slogans. For the first time, their mythology looks not noble, but suicidal, quaint, and tragically irrelevant against an enemy who massed steel, fuel, scientists, and factories. This is more than defeat. It's the moment their propaganda begins to unravel. The bomb didn't just destroy a city, it shredded the story they'd been telling themselves for years. The comforting fiction of the weak, decadent American, an enemy who could be broken by courage and sacrifice, crumbled in an instant. In its place stood something mechanical and merciless, a civilization with machines, money, and minds organized on a scale Japan had never imagined. For commanders raised to believe spirit could trump steel, the shock was existential. Strategy turned to ash. Pride gave way to a cold, animal fear. And worst of all, this was no one-off miracle. The evidence was only beginning to arrive, and it would make denial impossible. August 7th. New reconnaissance photos arrive, and someone lays them on the table like a verdict. The room leans in. The only sound is the soft slap of paper and the scrape of a chair. Faces fold toward the images. Eyes narrow. Breath catches. For a long beat, no one speaks. No frantic orders, no denials, just a weight that presses down on the bunker. The prints glint under the lamp, tiny squares that somehow contain something vast. You can feel the color drain from the room as each man reads what the photographs already say. This is not damage. This is something else entirely. They laid the reconnaissance photos on the table, and the room fell into a new kind of silence. Not shock so much as the slow, stunned intake of people discovering that everything they thought they knew had been erased. The images were brutal and simple. Hiroshima is gone. Not damaged, not ruined. It is flattened to bare earth. Streets, parks, neighborhoods reduced to a flat, pale plain. Even steel structures were not merely toppled, they'd been vaporized, as if someone had scoured the city down to its bones. The photos didn't just show destruction, they made belief itself feel fragile and easily wiped away. This was not another Tokyo firestorm. Those raids left blackened skeletons, piles of rubble, the ragged outlines of lives that had been burned away. Hiroshima offered something stranger and worse: absence. The reconnaissance photos didn't show ruins so much as a new landscape. Streets turned to dust. Concrete and steel vanished, as if the city had been erased down to its very atoms. There was no toppled city-state to mourn, only a flat, bleached plain where a metropolis had been. The destruction felt almost elemental, as if some blind, primeval force had rewritten the map in a single, terrible stroke. As the council reels from the confirmation, a new shockwave hits them. An aide bursts in, breathless, waving a diplomatic cable like a white flag. Papers scatter, conversations stop. Prime Minister Suzuki looks up, the wordless panic spreading across faces. The aide hands the cable to Togo. Hands shake as they break the seal. The message is short and brutal. The Soviet Union, the one neutral power they had hoped would mediate, has just declared war on the empire. For a moment, the room goes silent, a map gone black. No mediator, no refuge, only the sense that everything they'd been arguing about, honor, sacrifice, strategy, has collapsed. An aide slides a diplomatic cable across the table, and the room reads it in stunned silence. The neutral power they had quietly hoped would broker a face-saving peace, the Soviet Union, has just declared war on the Empire of Japan. The words land like a second blow. No mediator, no buffer, no way to split the difference. In an instant, their last political lifeline snaps. Faces go pale. Strategies that relied on bargaining or outside pressure collapse into one brutal fact. Japan now faces not only the American juggernaut, but a new, massive enemy on its doorstep, and whatever room for negotiation remained has vanished. Their last strategic hope vanishes in an instant. The Soviet declaration isn't a diplomatic note, it's a closing door. With Moscow now a belligerent, the neutral mediator they banked on is gone, and any slim path to a negotiated settlement evaporates. There will be no bargaining table to preserve territory, no backroom deal to save face, no graceful way out the generals can spin for the nation. Suddenly, Japan is surrounded by armies and immutable facts, not negotiators or excuses. The illusion of leverage collapses, leaving only the grim arithmetic of occupation, invasion, and surrender. General Anami stares at the map, and the world tilts. To the east are Americans armed with a weapon that erases cities. To the west, the Soviet horde pours across Manchuria. There are no buffers left, no negotiated middle ground, no distant battle that can reverse this. The empire he has defended becomes a collapsing star, territory falling away in every direction, gravity pulling everything inward. He feels the plan he sold himself for years unspool. Honor, sacrifice, a last stand. None will stop an enemy who can burn a city from the sky and a neighbor who can swallow whole armies. In that instant, he knows there is only one taste of survival left: surrender. August 8th. 1.5 million Soviet soldiers pour into Manchuria, and the elite Kwantung army collapses under the onslaught. At first, it's the scale that stuns them, the sheer weight of men and armor rolling forward. Then a smaller, colder detail appears in the photographs and radio reports. Many of the Soviet trucks and tanks are American-made. That single fact lands like a blow. America's factories are not only building weapons, they are arming a new front against Japan. Their last hope of a mediated settlement evaporates. The empire is now surrounded, outproduced, and outmaneuvered on every flank. At 11:02 on August 9th, in the middle of another exhausted, desperate meeting, an aide bursts in and lays a terse, coded cable on the table. Everyone leans in. The message is shockingly short and clinical. No flourish, no explanation, just facts that land like a verdict. Conversation dies. Faces drain. Years of argument and stubborn hope collapse into that single line. For a heartbeat, the room is suspended between denial and reality, and then something inside each man snaps. This is not a bluff, not propaganda, not a warning. They have been struck again, and the finality is unmistakable. Then the final proof arrived. Nagasaki had been hit. Not a freak accident, not a one-off miracle. It was the same logic of annihilation, delivered again, suddenly unmistakable. In one terse message, the room understood what charts and photos had only hinted at. Hiroshima was not a fluke. It was a production model. That phrase lands like a verdict. The planner's old certainties crumble. Tactics, honor, the whole calculus of sacrifice, irrelevant against an enemy who can manufacture ultimate destruction at scale. Faces go pale. Voices that argued for more fighting fall silent. The war they believed in ceases to exist. The choice is no longer about victory, but survival. In the emergency council that follows Nagasaki's news, whatever pretense remained simply collapses. Men who have argued and schemed for years sit speechless, their papers useless in their hands. Navy Minister Yonai, short on rhetoric and long on duty, cuts through the fog with a single sentence. This is the end. The room snaps to that truth. There is no clever reframe, no tactical workaround. You can feel years of doctrine unspooling. Faces go pale, voices die. For the first time, the war room isn't planning a battle. It's watching an empire's options evaporate, and Yonai's words hang in the air like a verdict. General Umezu, the same man who only days earlier insisted Hiroshima was a conventional raid, sits quiet and exhausted, and finally says what no one wanted to hear. The atomic bomb has changed warfare itself. Victory can no longer be measured by bayonet charges or defended shorelines. Cities can be wiped out from the sky. Armies can be shattered without a single landing. His voice is flat, stripped of rhetoric. If this is the new reality, the long plan to bleed them on our beaches stops being strategy and becomes mass sacrifice. In that admission, the last illusions in the room begin to crumble. In that stunned silence, the awful truth, the calculus of a decisive homeland battle, the plan to bleed them on the beaches, isn't heroic resistance at all, but mass suicide. They had pictured costly beaches, shattered units, a bargaining chip of sacrifice. They never imagined a single bomb could turn every shoreline into a pyre for their own people. Faces go pale. Pride curdles into guilt. The very language of honor suddenly sounds obscene. For the first time, the generals can see the human arithmetic of their plan, and the realization drains the room of any comforting illusion about what continued fighting would really mean. The enemy can now destroy their cities, their armies, and their people from the sky without ever landing a single soldier. No long sieges, no heroic last stands, no battlefield to meet them on. Everything the officer class taught, every doctrine of honor and sacrifice suddenly felt irrelevant, obsolete against a technology that erased whole neighborhoods in an instant. The logic of endurance, the hope that sheer will could outlast material might, collapsed under a new, terrifying fact. Victory no longer belonged to the bravest or the fiercest, but to whoever controlled a science powerful enough to vaporize a nation. It is over. In a private audience, the Emperor Hirohito speaks the words his generals could not. We must bear the unbearable. The phrase is simple. It lands like a verdict. Guards shift. Men who measured strategy in maps and honor look suddenly like ordinary listeners. When the sovereign who embodies the state says surrender is the only path, it strips the last veil from their purpose, turning doctrine into confession, courage into concession. He is not merely ordering an end to fighting. He is preparing a people to accept loss, to live on after annihilation. For the first time, duty points toward preservation rather than glory. Still, some officers quietly refuse to yield. Even the hardest-line officers, the ones who had spoken most loudly for honor and sacrifice, scramble now to salvage shards of dignity, haggling over terms, bargaining for ranks, insisting on clauses that will let them claim they never truly surrendered. Their voices are harsh, frantic, full of ritual indignation. But the rhetoric rings hollow. Days of reports, mushroom clouds, and a crushing industrial reality have emptied them out. By August 16th, the bluster has faded to stunned silence. Their threats are gestures without force. The fight that animated a nation has gone out of them. The psychological collapse is complete. They stepped onto the Missouri not as conquerors, but as supplicants. Stiff, silent, suddenly small on the polished deck of the very navy that had undone them. Around Tokyo Bay, a harbor full of ships stretched to the horizon. Above them, hundreds of aircraft drifted like a constant reminder. It was a lesson taught with steel and fuel, not speeches. The enemy's power was visible, material, and endless. For the Japanese delegation, every report and debate condensed into a single humiliating sightline: the overwhelming reach of an industrial war machine that had already decided their fate long before any final signature was inked. They stepped onto the Missouri, and the message was impossible to ignore. A fleet of American warships rolled to the horizon, an armada of steel, and overhead hundreds of aircraft stitched the sky with engines and shadow. An intentional, humiliating display of the very industrial might Japan had pretended not to see. Guns were quiet, but the sight spoke louder than any report. This was not victory theater, it was proof. Every strained excuse, every romantic notion of spirit over supply, every refusal to look at the facts was answered by that enormous, undeniable presence on the water and in the air. The truth is no longer in reports, it is on their streets. During the occupation, officials walking Tokyo don't need maps or memos, they see it. Lines of American supply trucks, neat and numerous, rumbling down avenues where Japanese convoys never existed. In one city, they count more transport than the entire Imperial Army possessed. Numbers become a public spectacle. The vague concept of American power crystallizes into trucks, planes, and refrigerators on every corner, and with it comes a quiet, corrosive humiliation. The old narratives, Yamato spirit, honorable sacrifice, start to sound like excuses. Reality, blunt and material, replaces myth. Colonel Sato's final report, titled simply "Why We Lost," lands like an indictment. We lost the war the moment we started it, because we did not understand our enemy. Short, brutal. Not a single weapon killed us, he explains, but an entire industrial and scientific system we refused to see. Factories that never slept, laboratories that turned theory into annihilation, supply lines that fed a war machine 10 times our size. For years, we dressed failure as honor, mistaking spirit for strategy. Now the evidence sat on the table, undeniable. Sato's conclusion isn't just history. It's a warning about the cost of living inside comforting myths until reality arrives in a blinding flash. The bomb wasn't the sole cause of Japan's defeat. It was the final, undeniable proof of something that had been growing for years, a profound, willful self-deception. What fell in August 1945 wasn't just cities and armies, but a national story, that spirit alone could outmatch industrial might. Colonel Sato's blunt report called that out. We lost because we did not understand our enemy. And suddenly the myths that sustained strategy had no purchase. That truth hit like the flash over Hiroshima. Sudden, blinding, impossible to ignore. If history offers one lesson, it is this unsettling question: how many of our own beliefs are built on illusions we refuse to see until reality arrives in a single, blinding flash?